Hi, this is Phil Leach. Welcome to part 3 of Hebrew Poetry and Psalms. In this session, I'd like to look at other poetic devices. In the last session, we looked particularly at Hebrew poetry and semantic parallelism, but now we want to look at variations on that and other devices that you will discover as you study the Psalms and other Hebrew poetry in the Old Testament. The first one is a variation on semantic parallelism, and that is climactic parallelism. Sometimes it's called staircase parallelism. And what this kind of parallelism does is combine synonymous and formal parallelism. So in this form, or this kind, the second line echoes part of the first line, but then it adds a phrase that develops the meaning and completes a sense, or the second line ends in a climactic statement, as you will see. So, as an example, we have ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings, and then the second line repeats a bit of the first, but then comes to a climax. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Another example is Psalm 93 verse 3. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. And then the second line, the floods have lifted up their voice. Another example from Exodus, the song celebrating the deliverance through the Red Sea. Exodus 15 verse 6. Thy right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Thy right hand, O Lord, shatters the enemy. And so you can see how there's an element of the synonymous, but then it comes to a climax. This is climactic parallelism. Another variation on synonymous parallelism is the chiasm. Some synonymous parallel verses have a chiastic structure in the lines or in the line phrases, but then some in the actual lines, in the couplets. And I'll give you an example of both. Psalm 22 verse 10, on you I was cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb you have been my God. Now, this is actually a couplet that is synonymous. On you I was cast is actually parallel to the second phrase of that next line. You have been my God. From my birth is parallel to the first phrase, and from my mother's womb. And so what you actually have is a chiasm with the second line switched around. The term chiasm comes from the Greek word chi, and that is indicated by an X or a cross, and so that is where the term comes from. Another example, Psalm 22:22. I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. And again, this is synonymous parallelism, but it's in a chiastic form. I will tell of your name corresponds to I will praise you to my brothers in the midst of the congregation. And again, you see the fact the second line is turned around, it creates that chiastic form. We also sometimes see this in a tristic or a triplet. In Psalm 22 verse 23, we have, you who fear the Lord, praise him, all you offspring of Jacob. And you see how there is this synonymous parallelism there. but then for the third line it switched around. You who fear the Lord is parallel to all you offspring of Jacob, all you offspring of Israel. And the phrase praise him is synonymous with glorify him and stand in awe of him. And so in that second two lines you see the chiastic form. We also see a chiasm in lines, between the different lines. Each couplet in this form, if you just saw the couplets together, you would think it was formal parallelism. But when you see two couplets together, you then see that there's actually a chiastic structure between them. Okay, best to show you an example. Psalm 31:3. This would seem to be formal parallelism. You are indeed my rock and my fortress. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me. And the next verse, verse 4. Take me out of the net hidden for me, for you are my refuge. But when we see them together, you are indeed my rock and my fortress, corresponds to the last line of the second couplet, for you are my refuge. For your name's sake, lead me and guide me, corresponds to take me out of the net hidden for me. And so when we see these two couplets together, we have a typical chiastic structure with the A, B, B, A form. Another example is Psalm 51, verse 1. Again, you have the two couplets of formal parallelism. Have mercy on me, O God, actually relates to the second line of the second couplet, blot out my transgression. According to your steadfast love corresponds to according to your abundant mercy. And so again, we have the ABBA structure in this chiastic form here. And so in Hebrew poetry, as you look at either the phrases in lines or the lines themselves, you can see this structure. Isaiah 6 verse 10 is another classic example of the chiasm, and you can see here verse 10, make the heart of this people fat and their ears heavy and shut their eyes, and then you see that mirror image of the typical chiasm, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. And you can see the reference there to the different body parts in a chiastic form. Another feature of poetry you will see in the Psalms and in other places too is the refrain. The refrain is where there is a repeated phrase or verse. Now the effect of this, of course, is for emphasis. Psalm 67 verse 3 and 5, you find these words repeated. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. That's repeated twice in that psalm. Psalm 80, verse 3, 7 and 19, you find, restore us, O God. Let your face shine that we may be saved. So this becomes a chorus or a refrain throughout the psalm, and if you look, you will notice them. There's a wonderful wisdom poem, or a poem about wisdom in Job 28. And in verse 12 and 20, you see, but where shall wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? And that becomes a refrain which underlines the emphasis and the point of that particular poem. Another poetic feature is what we call inclusio. Inclusio is where there is a correspondence between the beginning and the end of the psalm, and often the verse at the beginning and end is repeated. So it becomes like two bookends in which the psalm is sitting. Psalm 103, verse 1 and verse 22, the beginning and the end. Bless the Lord, O my soul. Psalm 118, 1 and verse 29. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. And that then becomes like bookends for that marvelous psalm. Another poetic feature that you will discover at times is the repetition of words that are really key or important in that psalm, again providing an emphasis in that particular poem. The noun voice in Psalm 29 is a good example of this, or the word keep in Psalm 121. Both of those are underlying an emphasis through their repetition. Another feature which actually is lost to us because of the translation from Hebrew into English or whatever language is what we know as acrostic poetry. This is when the first line, the first letter of each line, taken together, form a very recognizable pattern. And typically it would be going through each letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it will be in order, the typical order of the Hebrew alphabet. Psalm 119 is a good example of this, where in each stanza there's 8 verses, and each of those 8 verses begin with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And there's 22 stanzas, each relating to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So the first 8 verses will be the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the second 8 verses, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and so on. And there on the screen you see other psalms which are acrostic psalms. Interestingly enough, the poem about the virtuous wife at the end of Proverbs is an acrostic poem. In Lamentations there's 5 chapters. The first 4 chapters are all acrostic poems, with chapter 3 being 66 verses, you will see, and it is because it's in groups of 3. 3 verses, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then the next 3, the next letter, and so on and so forth. So these poems are highly structured, and you will, if you see 22 verses or a multiple of that, then very possibly that's because it's an acrostic poem. Another feature is what we know as an ellipsis in synonymous parallelism. And this is when you have the 2 synonymous parallel lines in the couplet, but in the second line, one of the elements is missing. But with the ellipsis concept, it's understood to apply to the second line. Again, let's have a look at some examples. Psalm 103 verse 7. He made known his ways to Moses, his acts to the people of Israel. When we look at the synonymous parallelism here, we see he made known is actually missing from the second line. It's an ellipsis. His ways corresponds to his acts. To Moses corresponds to the people of Israel. Now, if it did not have an ellipsis, maybe it would read as you see. He made known would correspond to something like he declares. And then you would have a perfectly balanced synonymous couplet. Another example is Psalm 105 verse 10. Breaking into this psalm we read, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant. Which he confirmed is an ellipsis in the second line. To Jacob corresponds synonymously to Israel. As an statute corresponds to as an everlasting covenant. Another poetic feature is what is known as a merismus. And what this is a device where extremes are used or spoken about to express totality or completeness. We see this in Psalm 95 verse 4. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. You notice this is actually a chiasm in these phrases, but it also speaks about the depth and the height, as low as you can go and as high as you can go, expressing totality. In the next verse you see a similar thing. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands formed. So this is a straightforward, synonymous, parallel verse, but speaking about the sea and the dry land that encompasses everything. And so in these two verses you have an example of merismus. Finally, I want to suggest, as you are exploring psalms and prophets and other poetry, wisdom literature, that as you observe different elements of Hebrew poetry, maybe these, what I've called study symbols, will help you. There is a symbol there for synonymous parallelism, the two lines together with all pointed in the same direction, indicating that the two lines are saying very similar things. Antithetic parallelism, two arrows facing one another, that they're saying opposite things. Synthetic parallelism, just one arrow because the second line seeks to complete the first. Staircase parallelism, two arrows pointing upwards as they're reaching a climax. Chiasm or chiastic parallelism, for the phrases just using an X, or for lines using the common letters for showing a chiasm, A, B, C, B, A, or whatever is needed. The refrain, a music note there with the verse numbers, or inclusio, the verse numbers in brackets, indicating they're like bookends. Finally, the ellipsis is the normal sign with a zero with a line through it, and then merismus, a line with two arrows, because it speaks about the extremes or totality.